Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of Kentucky. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to drop a comment, letting us know where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're genuinely curious about how far these documented stories reach, the places and the moments of day or night they find you. The autumn of 1907 settled over Harlan County with a stillness that felt almost unnatural. Pine Mountain cast long shadows down into the valleys below, where hunting cabins dotted the landscape along the Cumberland River. According to county records kept at the Harlan County Historical Society, between September and December of that year, 7 men who'd gone into those woods for the hunting season never made it back home. The official disappearances were noted in ledgers that have since yellowed with age, each entry written in the careful cursive of County Clerk Thomas Whitfield. Every man was listed with his age, his occupation, his last known location, and a brief, haunting notation: no remains recovered. Local newspapers, mainly the Harlan Daily Enterprise, reported the disappearances as separate incidents, likely blaming harsh weather or wild animal attacks. An editorial from October 28, 1907, suggested that the wilderness claims its due each season, a sentiment that reflected how casually the dangers of the Appalachian wilderness were accepted in that era. But a series of journals, discovered in 1962 during the renovation of an old homestead, hinted at something far more disturbing unfolding in those woods. That renovation was part of a federal initiative to develop recreational areas within what would later become the Daniel Boone National Forest. The property, about 23 miles southeast of Harlan proper, had been abandoned for decades. According to the work crew's foreman, Samuel Ledbetter, whose account was recorded in an internal Forest Service memorandum dated June 17, 1962, the journals were found beneath a loose floorboard in what had once been the main living area of a substantial log cabin. The journals belonged to Tobias and Elijah Blackwood, brothers who owned roughly 300 acres of dense woodland in the southeastern part of the county. The land deed, filed in 1876 and transferred to the brothers in 1899 after their father's death, described the property as rising from Cumberland waters to the ridge of Pine Mountain, encompassing Bear Creek Hollow and the eastern face of Stony Point. The journals, 3 leather-bound volumes with pages made by hand, held daily entries spanning from 1899 to late 1907. What follows is an account pieced together from those journals, county records, newspaper clippings, and interviews with descendants of Harlan County residents from that time. The investigation was never officially closed, and in 1967, the case was permanently archived in the Kentucky State Historical Society, where it has largely remained forgotten. The Blackwood brothers were known in McCreary County, the neighboring jurisdiction, as reclusive trappers who occasionally traded animal pelts in the small township of Whitley City. That town, established in 1868 as a logging outpost, was little more than a general store, a small church, and a cluster of wooden homes arranged along a single muddy street. According to trading post ledgers dated between 1903 and 1906, meticulously kept by proprietor Harold Jenkins, the brothers would appear roughly once every 3 months to exchange furs for supplies. Jenkins's record books, donated to the McCreary County Historical Society by his granddaughter in 1948, list what the brothers typically took away: salt, coffee beans, ammunition, occasionally tools, and very rarely tobacco for Elijah. The ledgers show that the brothers spoke little and handled their business efficiently before heading back to their property. An entry dated March 12, 1905 reads: Eve Blackwoods arrived at dawn, traded 7 fox pelts, 3 beaver, and 1 bear skin of exceptional quality, exchanged for usual supplies. plus one steel trap and a whetstone. Departed before other customers arrived. Paid balance of 1.37 in silver coins dated 1878-1881. The Trading Post owner Harold Jenkins noted in his personal diary that the brothers carried themselves with an unsettling quietness and that other patrons would clear space when they entered. An entry from November 1904 says, "The elder Blackwood Tobias stands near 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders like an ox. His hands bear the scars of countless seasons in the wilderness, yet he counts coins with the delicacy of a banker. His brother, smaller but no less imposing, watches the door as if expecting trouble that never arrives. They move through my establishment like wolves among sheep, and I find myself checking my inventory more carefully after their departures, though nothing has ever been missing." Jenkins also observed that the brothers appeared exceptionally well fed for men living so deep in the wilderness. Especially during winter months when game was scarce, their robust physiques stood in stark contrast to other mountain dwellers, who typically grew lean during harsh Kentucky winters. When asked about their hunting success, Tobias, the elder brother, would only reply that they had ways of ensuring the table was always full. That cryptic response appears multiple times across 4 years of Jenkins's diary entries, suggesting the merchant's persistent curiosity about their unusual prosperity. The brothers' cabin stood in a remote clearing about 17 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a narrow dirt path that twisted through dense pine forest. According to the recollections of James Harkins, a logger whose father had once delivered supplies to the Blackwood property in 1901, the approach to the cabin was marked by peculiar arrangements of stones placed at irregular intervals along the path. Harkins, interviewed in 1964 by local historian Margaret Wilson, recalled his father describing the stones as standing like silent sentinels, adding that they seemed to follow you with invisible eyes. The path itself was unusually level and well maintained for such a remote location, wide enough for a horse but not a wagon, forcing visitors to approach in single file. The location was marked on an 1899 survey map commissioned by the Kentucky Land Office, but subsequent maps from 1910 onward omit any mention of the property or its structures. It's as if the land itself conspired to forget. The 1910 Geological Survey, conducted as part of a coal exploration initiative, shows only uninhabited wilderness where the Blackwood property should have been, despite the cabin's substantial construction, which should have persisted well beyond that date. The cabin itself, according to the few who saw it, was unusually large for a wilderness dwelling. Built of hand, hewn oak logs notched and fitted with remarkable precision. It featured a stone foundation that extended about 10 feet into the ground, creating what witnesses described as a full underground level accessible via a trapdoor in the main room. Luther Collins, a hunting guide who claimed to have visited the cabin once in 1906, provided a statement to the Harlan County Sheriff in 1908 during the belated investigation into the disappearances. His description, preserved in the case files, notes that the main floor contained a large central room with a massive stone fireplace, 2 smaller rooms, presumably used as bedrooms, and a separate kitchen area with an unusual brick oven built into the wall. Collins reported that what struck him most was the brothers' collection of knives displayed on a wooden rack near the kitchen entrance. Must have been 30 or 40 different blades, his statement reads. Some I recognized as hunting or skinning knives, but others looked like surgeon's tools, all kept polished and arranged by size. Elijah saw me looking and said they were family heirlooms from their father's time as a field medic during the war. Before the hunting season of 1907, the Blackwood brothers had lived relatively unnoticed by authorities. Their property taxes were paid annually through a lawyer in Whitley City, a Mr. Jonathan Pierce, whose brief notes indicate that the brothers inherited the land from their father, who had acquired it during post-Civil War land redistribution. Pierce's legal ledger, discovered in a filing cabinet donated to the County Historical Society in 1951, contained minimal information about his unusual clients. His notes show that he met the brothers only twice. Once after their father's death to execute the will, and again in 1902 to draft a document ensuring that if either brother died, the property would pass fully to the survivor, with no claims permitted from any other parties. Pierce noted that this request seemed odd, given that neither brother was known to have any other family or heirs, but he fulfilled it without question. According to courthouse records, the senior Blackwood had been a Union soldier who received the parcel as compensation for his service. Military records accessed in 1965 by researchers identified him as Sergeant Ezekiel Blackwood, formerly of the 13th Kentucky Volunteer Infantry, Company C. His service record indicated he served as a field hospital assistant during the latter years of the war, with a notation that he was particularly skilled in amputation procedures. Pierce's notes, found in the same filing cabinet, mentioned that the brothers' father had peculiar dietary requirements that necessitated their isolated lifestyle. In a letter to a colleague dated 1904, Pierce elaborated slightly. The elder Blackwood suffered from some digestive malady acquired during his military service. According to his sons, he could consume only very fresh meat prepared in specific ways, or he would suffer terribly. This condition apparently informed his choice of such an isolated homestead, where game was plentiful and neighbors scarce. No further explanation was provided, and medical records from that era were not detailed enough to identify what condition might have required such specific dietary restrictions. The brothers themselves had no formal education beyond what their father had taught them, and neither had ever married. Their isolation was nearly complete, except for their quarterly trading expeditions. Local children were warned to avoid the area near Pine Mountain, where the Blackwoods lived, though no specific reason was given beyond the usual cautions about respecting private property. Eliza Jenkins, daughter of the trading post owner, recalled in a 1966 interview that her father would say, "So as those who wander onto Blackwood land tend not to wander back off it." What triggered the events of 1907 remains unclear. Some suggest it was the unusually cold September that pushed game animals deeper into the mountains, causing hunters to venture further into the Blackwoods territory than in previous years. Weather records from the Louisville Meteorological Station document that September 1907 saw temperatures averaging 120 degrees below normal, with an early frost on September 10th that damaged crops throughout the region. Others point to a county ordinance passed that summer that eliminated private property restrictions for licensed hunters during hunting season, a measure designed to prevent wealthy landowners from monopolizing the best hunting grounds. The ordinance, preserved in the county records, stated that these from September 1st to December 31st, licensed hunters may pursue game across property boundaries, provided they do not damage structures or livestock. The Blackwoods reportedly appeared at a county meeting to oppose this ordinance, one of their only known appearances in town. But their objections were overruled. The meeting minutes note only that an objection was raised by residents of Pine Mountain District, without naming the brothers specifically. Whatever the cause, it brought strangers into the brothers' domain, and something in the Blackwoods shifted. The first disappearance occurred on September 17, 1907. William Thornton, a 43-year-old bank clerk from Lexington, had traveled to Harlan County with 3 companions for their annual hunting trip. a tradition they'd kept for 5 years. They established a camp near the Cumberland River, about 7 miles from the Blackwood property. According to a statement given to the Harlan County Sheriff by Edward Rawlins, one of Thornton's companions, William had told them he was going to check traps along the eastern ridge of Pine Mountain. He was in high spirits that morning, Rawlins stated. Having shot a sizable buck the previous day, he mentioned wanting to set traps rather than hunt directly, as he believed the cold weather had driven smaller game into the higher elevations. Thornton departed camp at around 8:30 in the morning, carrying his Winchester rifle, a skinning knife, and a small pack with food and water. When he failed to return by sundown, his companions became concerned. According to the sheriff's report filed on September 20th, 1907, Thornton's 3 companions waited until nightfall before searching for him. They found his rifle leaning against a tree about 4 miles from their camp, along with a partially filled canteen and a blood-stained handkerchief. The report notes that the rifle appeared to have been placed deliberately rather than dropped, suggesting Mr. Thornton had set it aside voluntarily. No other trace of the man was discovered. The sheriff's report notes that a storm moved in that evening, washing away any potential tracks. A search party consisting of the sheriff, 2 deputies, and several local volunteers combed the area for 3 days, but found no further evidence. The search was abandoned on September 23rd, with Sheriff Harlan Daniels concluding that Thornton had likely suffered an accident in the rough terrain and either succumbed to injuries or was carried off by scavengers. The report's final notation reads, Mr. Thornton's disappearance, while tragic, is consistent with the dangers inherent to hunting in remote areas. His companions returned to Lexington, where Thornton's wife would later commission a headstone in the Lexington Cemetery, though no body was ever recovered to place beneath it. A month later, on October 23rd, 2 brothers from Cincinnati, James and Robert Caldwell, failed to return to their lodgings in Cumberland. The men, aged 28 and 31 respectively, were experienced hunters who traveled to Kentucky specifically to hunt white-tailed deer, which were abundant in the region. They'd arrived on October 20th and taken rooms at a boarding house run by Mrs. Edith Simmons, a widow whose establishment catered to out-of-state hunters. The men had told their landlady they intended to hunt deer in the southern part of Harlan County, near the Tennessee border. According to Mrs. Simmons's statement to Sheriff Daniels, recorded on October 25th, the brothers had mentioned finding promising sign near a creek that feeds into the Cumberland, up where the mountains get steep. This description matches the general vicinity of the Blackwood property, though Mrs. Simmons wasn't familiar enough with the area to make that connection. The Caldwell brothers' horses returned to the stable without riders 2 days after the men departed. The stable hand, Joseph Miller, reported that the horses appeared agitated but not injured and were still saddled. Mrs. Simmons reported in her statement that the saddlebags contained an unusual amount of meat wrapped in oilcloth, which she assumed to be venison. Not considering it significant at the time, and believing the brothers had perhaps gone to retrieve more game, she prepared the meat for her boarders. The meat was consumed before the brothers were officially declared missing. When investigators questioned her about its appearance or taste, she reported nothing unusual, stating only that it was tender, as if from a young animal. She recalled that one boarder, a Mr. Douglas from Virginia, had commented that it was the sweetest venison he'd ever tasted, and had asked about the brothers' hunting location so he might try his luck in the same area. Mrs. Simmons didn't recall whether she'd provided him with that information. Sheriff Daniels organized another search party when the Caldwell brothers were reported missing, focusing on the area south of Cumberland, where they'd indicated they'd be hunting. The search lasted 5 days, but yielded no results beyond a single spent rifle cartridge that couldn't be definitively linked to either brother's weapon. The Sioux Cincinnati Enquirer ran a small article about the missing men on November 2, 1907, noting that they were presumed lost to the hazards of the Kentucky wilderness. Their parents traveled to Harlan County in mid-November but returned to Ohio without answers. In a cruel irony, Robert Caldwell's wife was expecting their first child, who would be born in February 1908, never having known his father. A letter from Mrs. Rebecca Caldwell to Sheriff Daniels, dated March 1908 and preserved in the case file, pleads for any additional information about her husband's fate. The sheriff's response, if one was sent, is not included in the records. The third disappearance occurred in early November and involved a solitary hunter named Frederick Schmidt, a German immigrant who lived in Louisville and worked as a butcher. Schmidt, 39, had traveled to Harlan County alone on November 3rd. According to the guest register, at the Railroad Hotel in Harlan Town, he signed out on the morning of November 5th, telling the clerk he planned to hunt for several days before returning. Schmidt never checked back into the hotel, and his disappearance wasn't noted until November 15th, when he failed to return to his job in Louisville. His employer, concerned about his reliable worker's absence, contacted authorities. By the time Sheriff Daniels was notified, nearly 2 weeks had passed since Schmidt was last seen. A cursory search was conducted, but winter weather had set in, making a thorough investigation impossible. Schmidt's hunting equipment, including a distinctive German-made hunting rifle with his name engraved on the stock, was never recovered. The fourth and fifth disappearances occurred simultaneously and involved 2 local men brothers, in-law Thomas Howard and Peter Jenkins, who left their homes in Cumberland on November 26th for what was intended to be a 2-day hunting trip. Howard, a coal miner, and Jenkins, a carpenter, were lifelong residents of Harlan County and familiar with the terrain. According to Statement Seminary, their wives, who were sisters. The men had mentioned hunting in the high country because game had become scarce in their usual hunting grounds closer to town. When they failed to return on November 28th, their family members immediately reported their absence to Sheriff Daniels. A search party was quickly assembled, consisting primarily of fellow miners and neighbors who knew the men well. Despite their familiarity with the area, the search party found no trace of Howard or Jenkins beyond their initial campsite, which appeared to have been abandoned hastily. The campfire had been extinguished, but their cooking equipment was left behind, along with a partially dressed rabbit carcass that had been left to spoil. The men's rifles were missing, suggesting they'd been armed when they left camp. The sixth disappearance, occurring on December 12th, involved Reverend Isaiah Thornfield, a traveling preacher from Tennessee who'd been conducting revival meetings in small communities throughout Harlan County. According to his assistant, a young man named Timothy Greer, Reverend Thornfield had expressed interest in delivering his message to the more isolated homesteads in the region. The Reverend believed no soul was too remote to receive the word. Greer stated in his report to authorities that he'd heard of reclusive families living in the mountains who hadn't seen a preacher in years and felt called to minister to them. Thornfield departed on horseback on the morning of December 12th, carrying his Bible and a small bag of provisions. His horse returned to the church in Harlan 3 days later without its rider. The saddlebags contained the Reverend's Bible, apparently untouched. but his other belongings were missing. Greer organized a search with church members, but like the previous attempts, it yielded no results. The final disappearance of the season, and perhaps the most disturbing in retrospect, occurred on December 23rd. Mary Caldwell, the sister of the missing Caldwell brothers, had traveled from Cincinnati to Harlan County, determined to discover what had happened to her brothers. Despite warnings about the dangerous winter conditions, she hired a local guide named Jeremiah Stone to take her to the area where her brothers had planned to hunt. According to Stone's subsequent statement to authorities, they set out on the morning of December 23rd. Following the general direction Mrs. Simmons had indicated the Caldwell brothers had taken. Stone reported that as they approached the foothills of Pine Mountain, Mary Caldwell had insisted on proceeding alone for a short distance to a ridge where she believed she could get a better view of the surrounding terrain. Stone claimed he'd advised against this, yielded to her insistence, agreeing to wait with the horses. After about 30 minutes, he became concerned and followed her path, but found no trace of her. As darkness approached, he returned to Cumberland to seek help. A search party formed the next morning, Christmas Eve, but a severe snowstorm delayed their efforts. By the time weather permitted a thorough search, any tracks or evidence had been obliterated by several feet of snow. Mary Caldwell was never found. 7 disappearances within a single hunting season represented an unprecedented pattern that should have triggered a more thorough investigation. However, several factors contributed to the lack of a coordinated response. The victims came from different locations. Many were out-of-state visitors without local connections, and the disappearances were spread over several months. Sheriff Daniels, according to county records, was also dealing with labor unrest at several coal mines during this period, which consumed much of his department's resources. Additionally, the remote and dangerous nature of the terrain made extensive searches difficult, especially as winter set in. The Harlan Daily Enterprise published an editorial on January 8, 1908, noting the unusual number of missing persons, but attributing it to the particularly harsh winter conditions and an influx of inexperienced hunters unfamiliar with the treacherous mountain landscape. The editorial concluded with a call for stricter regulation of hunting licenses for out-of-state visitors, but made no suggestion of foul play. Years passed, and the events of 1907 faded from public memory. The Blackwood property remained untouched until 1932, when the land was officially reclaimed by the county due to unpaid taxes following the presumed deaths of the brothers, who hadn't been seen at the trading post since December 1907. The last recorded sighting of either brother was on December 26, 1907, when Elijah Blackwood made an unusual wintertime journey to the trading post in Whitley City. Harold Jenkins's diary entry from that date notes that Elijah appeared haggard and distracted, his clothes stained, his manner more agitated than I had ever observed. Jenkins recorded that Elijah traded an unusually large quantity of meat and pelts, purchasing supplies that suggested long-term travel, preserved foods, ammunition, a new knife, and a heavy coat. When Jenkins inquired about Tobias, Elijah reportedly replied, "My brother remains at home tending to private matters." Jenkins noted that Elijah departed heading west, rather than north toward the Blackwood property, and that was the last confirmed sighting of either brother. The property was incorporated into what would later become part of the Daniel Boone National Forest. The deed transfer filed in the Harlan County Courthouse on April 15, 1932, describes the land as abandoned and without structures of value, suggesting the cabin had been destroyed or deteriorated significantly in the intervening years. No one showed interest in the remote parcel until 1962, when the Forest Service planned to construct a fire observation tower on the highest point of the former Blackwood land. During excavation for the tower's foundation, workers discovered the remains of a cabin that had apparently burned decades earlier. The site report, filed by project supervisor Samuel Lidbetter, notes that the foundation extends approximately 10 feet below ground level, with evidence of multiple underground rooms or chambers, unusual for structures of this region and era. Among the charred timbers, they found a metal box containing 3 leather-bound journals, partially damaged by fire, but still legible. The discovery was reported to Forest Service headquarters in Winchester, Kentucky, where officials decided the find had historical rather than criminal significance due to the apparent age of the materials. The journals were initially stored in the Forest Service Regional Office in Winchester, but were transferred to the State Historical Archives in Frankfort in 1964. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, an anthropologist from the University of Kentucky, examined the journals as part of a research project on Appalachian isolation communities. Her preliminary report, dated October 3, 1964, describes the journals as a remarkable window into the psychology of extreme isolation and the development of parallel moral systems in remote communities. Montgomery noted that the journals contained daily entries written in 2 distinct handwritings, presumed to be those of Tobias and Elijah Blackwood. The entries from 1899 through early 1907 focused primarily on mundane aspects of wilderness survival, hunting reports, weather observations, maintenance of their property, and occasional philosophical reflections that Montgomery described as surprisingly articulate for men with presumably limited formal education. Beginning in March 1907, however, the tone of the entries, particularly those attributed to Tobias, began to shift. Montgomery's notes reveal that Tobias wrote with increasing frequency about encroachment and as violations of their territory. An entry dated March 23, 1907, reads, "Found boot prints along the eastern creek bed. Strangers walking our land without permission or acknowledgement. Father would not have tolerated such trespass." Subsequent entries tracked Tobias's growing paranoia about outsiders with increasingly hostile language. By August, he was writing about setting additional deterrents along the property boundaries, though he didn't specify what these entailed. Elijah's entries during this period expressed concern about his brother's changing demeanor. On August 17th, he wrote of, "He rarely sleeps, spends nights walking the perimeter, speaks often of father's lessons and our duty to the land. I fear the isolation has begun to wear on his mind. Yet he refuses to consider even our customary trading journey this month." The most disturbing entries, however, were recipes. According to Dr. Montgomery's analysis, submitted to this Journal of Appalachian Studies, but never published, the journals contained detailed instructions for preparing various cuts of meat from what the brothers referred to as two-legged game. The entries became more frequent and detailed starting in September 1907, with Tobias Blackwood writing on September 18th, "Loon expected bounty yesterday. Trespasser carried identification from a Lexington banking establishment. Elijah processed the meat, while I disposed of the remainder as father taught us. The liver was exceptionally tender when prepared with wild onions and salt. We will preserve the rest using the smoking technique father preferred for the leaner portions." Montgomery's report notes that subsequent entries detailed specific preparation methods for different cuts, with Tobias expressing particular enthusiasm for certain preparations. His entry from October 25th reads, "The older one provided better marbling in the flank portions. Elijah objects to my terminology, but father was always clear that proper nomenclature is essential to proper preparation. We are not savages. We are custodians of an ancient knowledge. Fee. Elijah's entries during this period became increasingly distressed. On November 3rd, he wrote, "T is merely protecting what is ours, as Father would have wanted. But Father's hunger was born of necessity during wartime. Not this eagerness T now displays. He speaks of setting lures rather than merely defending our boundaries. I find myself unable to sleep, though the meat does sustain us through these cold nights." By December, the brothers appeared to be in conflict. An entry from December 14th in Elijah's handwriting reads confronted T about the preacher. There was no threat there. The man merely sought to bring his God to our door. T said all trespassers are the same. That intention matters not when the result is violation of our sanctuary. He becomes more like Father with each passing day, but Father at least maintained control of his appetites. Montgomery's research was abruptly discontinued in November 1964, and her paper was withdrawn from publication. University records indicate she requested a sabbatical shortly thereafter and relocated to Oregon. She never returned to the research. The journals themselves were placed in restricted access storage following a review by the State Attorney General's office in early 1965. A brief memo attached to the case file states only that no actionable evidence exists to warrant further investigation of incidents occurring more than 50 years prior, particularly when no identifiable remains have been recovered. The case was officially designated SICRIS, historical interest only, and archived. In the years that followed Montgomery's abandoned research, a folklore collector named Martin Ridley traveled through Harlan County recording oral histories. In 1966, he interviewed Abigail Jenkins, the 87-year-old daughter of the trading post owner who had known the Blackwood brothers. The transcript of this interview, deposited in the American Folklore Collection at the Library of Congress, contains a chilling account. "My father rarely spoke of the Blackwoods," Jenkins told Ridley, "but there were things he told me near the end of his life that he'd kept secret for decades." According to Jenkins, her father had once told her that in December 1907, Elijah Blackwood had come to the trading post alone, his behavior more erratic than usual. The father said Elijah's hands trembled so badly he could barely count his coins, Jenkins recalled. His clothes were stained dark in places, and he smelled of smoke, and something father said was like a slaughterhouse. He traded an unprecedented amount of meat, which he claimed was venison and wild boar, though father noted it was packaged differently than their usual offerings. Jenkins continued, "Father said Elijah kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to follow him into the store. When father asked after Tobias, Elijah became agitated and said something that father found disturbing enough to remember word for word. Tobias has developed a taste that can't be satisfied with animal flesh alone. I fear he's changing into something father always warned about." Elijah reportedly paid for his supplies with several gold coins, rather than the silver they typically used. And when Jenkins's father commented on this, Elijah explained they had fleurs found the coins in a trespasser's pockets. Before departing, Elijah allegedly told Jenkins's father, Modrev, "If Tobias comes looking, you never saw me. For your own safety, remember that." Elijah never returned to the trading post after that visit. Jenkins also recounted that several items belonging to missing hunters were discovered for sale in Knoxville the following spring. A pocket watch matching the description of one owned by William Thornton reportedly surfaced in a pawn shop, while a distinctive hunting knife belonging to one of the Caldwell brothers was recognized by a fellow Cincinnati hunter in a Knoxville general store. However, no connection to the Blackwoods was ever established, and authorities considered the appearances of these items coincidental. possibly the result of theft by scavengers who had found the missing hunters' abandoned equipment. The interview concludes with Jenkins sharing a disturbing detail omitted from official reports. Her father had sampled the meat Elijah brought in that final visit and became violently ill afterward. Father said he'd never been so sick, Jenkins told Ridley. He described it as if his body was rejecting something fundamentally wrong. He couldn't keep food down for nearly a week afterward. On his deathbed years later, he confessed to her his suspicion that he had unwittingly consumed human flesh. He told me, Abigail, I've carried this knowledge like a stone in my gut for years. That wasn't any deer or boar Elijah brought in that day. I have been a hunter all my life and know the taste of every animal these mountains produce. What I tasted that day was something else entirely, and may God forgive me for it. When Ridley asked if Jenkins's father had ever reported his suspicions to authorities, she replied that he had not. Who would believe such a thing? And by the time he was certain, years had passed and the Blackwoods were long gone. That the physical evidence of what occurred in those woods in 1907 has largely vanished. The fire that destroyed the Blackwood cabin appears to have been deliberately set, though by whom remains unknown. Forensic analysis of the site, conducted cursorily in 1962 as part of the tower construction project, indicated that the fire had burned at an unusually high temperature consistent with the use of accelerants. The project report notes that evidence suggests multiple points of origin for the fire, inconsistent with accidental causes such as lightning strikes or chimney fires. This finding was not pursued further at the time, as the age of the site placed it outside criminal interest. In 1967, before the construction of the fire tower was completed, workers discovered a series of stone-lined pits about half a mile from the cabin site. Forest Service reports describe these as possible root cellars or storage facilities. Approximately 6 feet deep and 8 feet in diameter, lined with fitted stones and covered with heavy wooden lids that had partially collapsed over time. Work was halted when bone fragments were found among the stones. Dr. Walter Richardson, a forensic anthropologist consulted by the Forest Service, conducted a brief examination of the fragments and concluded they were as non-human, likely deer or wild boar, noting that the cutting marks visible on some specimens are consistent with butchering practices common in the region. His report, dated June 8, 1967, recommended resuming construction, and the pits were filled in and covered. No photographs of these excavations exist in public records, though an internal Forest Service memo requested all materials related to the discovery be forwarded to the regional office. Dr. Richardson's original field notes, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 1978 by journalist Thomas Carter, contain an observation omitted from the official report. Several of the larger bone fragments exhibit unusual cutting patterns inconsistent with standard game butchery. The precision of certain cuts suggests knowledge of anatomy beyond that typically possessed by hunters or trappers. Without more complete specimens, conclusive identification is impossible, but the possibility of human remains can't be entirely ruled out. The fire tower stood for only 7 years before being decommissioned due to what official reports called persistent structural issues and unexplained equipment failures. Rangers assigned to the tower frequently requested transfers, citing in their reports unsettling noises and a persistent odor of cooking meat despite the remote location. One ranger, David Coleman, submitted a detailed incident report in August 1970, describing what he called an unnerving experience during his overnight shift. At approximately 2:15 a.m., I was awakened by what sounded like multiple individuals moving around the base of the tower, Coleman wrote. When I called out and shined my flashlight, there was no one visible. Yet the sounds continued for nearly 20 minutes. The following morning, I found numerous footprints in the soft earth surrounding the tower, circling the structure completely, yet no tracks leading to or from the area. Coleman requested transfer the following day. His report was filed but not investigated. The tower was dismantled in 1974, and the area was designated as a wildlife conservation zone with restricted public access. The most compelling piece of evidence that something truly horrific occurred on the Blackwood property comes from a source outside official channels. In 1968, a private collector of Civil War memorabilia purchased a trunk of documents at an estate sale in Knoxville. Among these papers was a letter dated January 3, 1908, from Elijah Blackwood to a cousin in Tennessee. The collector, Herbert Simmons, recognized the name from regional folklore and brought the letter to the attention of Dr. Montgomery, who had resumed teaching at the University of Kentucky, but had abandoned her research on the Blackwood case. Montgomery authenticated the letter by comparing the handwriting with journal entries known to be written by Elijah, confirming its likely legitimacy. The letter, written on water-stained paper and fading ink, contains a confession of sorts. Dearest cousin, the letter begins, though we have never met, I write to you, as my last remaining blood relation, according to father's records. What I must confess may never reach your eyes, as I doubt my resolve to actually post this letter. Yet, I must set down the truth somewhere before I depart this world, or lose my mind entirely. Elijah wrote that his father had taught them that human flesh contained special properties that would grant strength and longevity if consumed regularly. He claimed that their father, Ezekiel Blackwood, had survived the harsh winter of 1865 while serving with the Union Army by consuming the flesh of fallen soldiers, developing an addiction he passed to his sons through both instruction and practice. Father taught us that certain men, particularly those who lived clean lives and abstained from spirits, provided meat that could sustain not just the body, but the spirit. The letter continues. He called it the ultimate sustenance and believed it had extended his life beyond natural limits. He trained us to identify suitable subjects to prepare the meat in ways that preserved what he called its essence, and to dispose of the remaining evidence in ways that nature herself would conceal. Elijah described how following their father's death in 1899, he and Tobias had initially abstained from the practice, subsisting on conventional game. However, during a particularly harsh winter in 1901, Tobias had reverted to their father's ways when a lost trapper sought shelter in their cabin. He justified it as self-defense, as the man had become delirious with fever and threatened us with his knife, Elijah wrote. But I saw the look in my brother's eyes as he prepared the meat, the same hunger that had possessed father in his final years. According to the letter, the brothers reached an uneasy compromise, wherein they would only consume individuals who trespassed on their land and posed some perceived threat. This arrangement held until the hunting season of 1907, when the county ordinance brought more hunters into their territory. Elijah claimed that Tobias had become increasingly possessed by this hunger, eventually hunting humans deliberately rather than opportunistically consuming trespassers. He began to set traps not for animals but for men, the letter states. He studied their movements, identified their camps, and selected targets with the precision father had taught us for choosing prime deer. What had once been reluctant necessity became eager pursuit. The letter states that on Christmas Eve 1907, Elijah discovered Tobias preparing a stew containing parts of a young woman who had been searching for her missing hunter husband. When I recognized female garments among the discarded belongings, Something broke within me, Elijah wrote. Father had been explicit that women were never to be considered suitable. Something fundamental had changed in Tobias. He was consuming not for sustenance, but for pleasure. The expression on his face as he stirred that pot haunts me still. According to the letter, this crossed some moral line for Elijah, who claimed to have killed his brother that night and burned their cabin with Tobias inside. Dull's eye struck him from behind with father's old army shovel as he bent over the hearth. I told myself it was mercy, not murder. That the brother I had known was already gone, replaced by something that merely wore his face. I poured coal oil over everything that would burn and lit the flame that I hoped would purify what we had become. Perhaps it is cowardice that I did not join him in that pyre. The letter concludes with Elijah's statement that he was heading west to escape the hunger that never truly leaves. His final lines read, I feel it still, cousin, the craving father planted in us. In my dreams I taste it still and wake famished for something dear and rabbit cannot satisfy. I go west to lose myself where no one knows the name Blackwood. Though I fear that what father awakened in our blood can never truly be put to rest. If there is a God, may he forgive what we have done in these mountains. I know I shall never forgive myself. The collector who found this letter attempted to contact authorities in 1968, but was reportedly told the case was closed due to the passage of time and lack of evidence that could lead to prosecution. The letter's current whereabouts are unknown, as the collection was dispersed after the collector's death in 1969. Dr. Montgomery, who had seen and transcribed the letter, refused to discuss it further, stating only that some historical materials are best left unexamined. The legacy of the Blackwood brothers manifests in the curious fact that the southeastern portion of what is now Daniel Boone National Forest has one of the lowest hunter visitation rates in the entire Appalachian region. Despite abundant game and spectacular vistas, the area remains largely untraveled. A Forest Service visitor analysis conducted in 1978 found that hunters and hikers alike tend to avoid the specific section that once contained the Blackwood property, even when unaware of its history. Local guides refuse to take groups to the area, citing dangerous terrain or protected wildlife habitats. Jeremiah Holbrook, a hunting guide interviewed for the analysis, stated simply, "There are places in these mountains that don't welcome human presence. That's one of them. Animals know it too. You won't find deer or turkey in that hollow, no matter how good the foraging might be." VEF Park rangers interviewed for the same assessment acknowledged an unofficial policy of discouraging camping or hunting in that section. "We don't put it in the official guidelines," one ranger explained. "But new staff are quietly advised to direct visitors elsewhere. We've had too many incidents over the years. Equipment failures, unexplained injuries, hikers reporting disorientation, even with compass and map." One ranger, speaking anonymously, admitted, "There's something not right about that hollow. Animals avoid it. Plants grow wrong there. Twisted somehow, even though the soil and sunlight are no different than the surrounding areas. We just tell people the area is being rehabilitated." When pressed for specifics about these anomalies, rangers typically offered vague responses or changed the subject. The coordinates that would have marked the Blackwood cabin do not appear on any official forest maps produced after 1970. In fact, topographical surveys seem to skirt the area entirely, leaving a small but noticeable blank space in the otherwise meticulously documented national forest. This cartographical omission was officially attributed to a surveying error that was never corrected, though several former Forest Service employees have suggested it was intentional. Perhaps most telling is the fate of those who have attempted to investigate the Blackwood case over the years. Dr. Montgomery abandoned her promising academic career shortly after examining the journals, taking a position teaching at a community college in Oregon, where she reportedly refused to discuss her previous research. Thomas Carter, the journalist who filed the Freedom of Information Act request in 1978, published a single article about the Blackwood case in a small regional magazine before abandoning the subject entirely. When contacted by subsequent researchers in the early 1980s, he refused to discuss the matter, saying only that some stories carry consequences for those who tell them. Martin Ridley, who interviewed Abigail Jenkins, died unexpectedly of a heart attack just weeks after depositing his recordings at the Library of Congress, despite having no history of cardiac issues. Dr. Chet Richardson, who examined the bone fragments found at the site, requested reassignment to a university in California shortly after submitting his report and never published on forensic anthropology again. In the decades since, the story of the Blackwood brothers has been reduced to a footnote in the region's rich tapestry of folklore. Local residents might share watered-down versions around campfires, usually framing it as a tale of two strange hermits who may have attacked trespassers rather than consumed them. The more disturbing elements have been largely excised from the oral tradition, perhaps out of a collective desire to forget. Occasional rumors surface of hikers finding unusual stone formations or metal implements in the unmapped section of the forest, but no official investigations have been conducted. In 1992, a backpacker reported discovering what appeared to be a stone-lined pit similar to those described in the 1967 Forest Service reports. But when rangers visited the coordinates he provided, they found no such structure. The backpacker later recanted his claim, stating he must have become disoriented in the dense forest. The last documented reference to the case in government records appears in a 1973 internal memo from the Kentucky State Police Archives, authorizing the transfer of all materials related to the 1907 disappearances to deep storage with a notation that they are to be preserved, but not digitized or included in any public-facing catalog. The memo includes a curious addendums. VAFE annual verification of secure containment required. Why files relating to a case more than 60 years old would require annual security checks is not explained. A Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2002 seeking access to these materials was denied, citing SU's ongoing investigation status, despite the case having been officially closed decades earlier. When pressed for clarification, state officials claimed the designation was an administrative error, but still refused access to the files. Perhaps most telling is the fact that even today, hunting licenses issued in Harlan County include a map with a shaded area marked simply as environmentally sensitive zone. No hunting permitted. This zone corresponds precisely to the former Blackwood property, though no official explanation for the restriction is provided to license holders. The designation cannot be traced to any specific environmental protection order or wildlife conservation initiative. Local residents know better than to ask. They simply nod and avoid the area, particularly in autumn, when the hunger of predators grows strongest. The mountain has kept its secrets for over a century now. Perhaps that is for the best. During the research for this account in 1968, a journalist from the Louisville Courier-Journal traveled to the area to interview elderly residents who might have remembered the events of 1907. Most refused to speak on record, but one man, then in his 90s, offered a perspective that perhaps best captures the lingering shadow of the Blackwood brothers. "The mountains remember what people try to forget," he told the journalist. Those brothers weren't the first to develop unusual appetites in these hills, and I doubt they'll be the last. Some hungers, he said, don't die with the men who felt them. They sink into the soil, seep into the water, and wait for someone new to feed them. The journalist's article was never published. His notes were found in his abandoned vehicle near the forest boundary. The journalist himself was reported missing, but was later discovered in a hospital in Nashville, having checked himself in under a false name. He had no memory of the 3 days following his interview and left journalism shortly thereafter. When contacted by researchers in 1969, he refused to discuss the Blackwood case, saying only these aims some stories aren't meant to be told. Some appetites shouldn't be remembered. Perhaps he was right. Or perhaps in forgetting, we allow such appetites to grow hungry again. What is certain is that something happened in those Kentucky woods in the autumn of 1907. Something that transformed 7 missing persons cases into a legacy of whispered warnings and averted gazes. The official records may be sealed, the witnesses long dead, and the physical evidence destroyed by time, but the hollow where the Blackwood cabin once stood remains empty of both wildlife and visitors. In a forest teeming with life, that silence speaks volumes. In the years since this investigation was compiled, the eastern ridge of Pine Mountain has been occasionally subject to unexplained forest fires, despite no lightning strikes or human campfires reported in the vicinity. Rangers note that these fires typically occur in late September or October, burning intensely but never spreading beyond the boundaries of what was once Blackwood land. After each fire, rangers report finding unusual arrangements of stones that were not present before the blaze. Circular patterns reminiscent of cooking pits that appear to have been recently used, despite the area being officially off-limits to visitors. Perhaps it is merely the wind and rain rearranging the landscape after the fires pass through, or perhaps, as local folklore suggests, some appetites burn eternal, rekindled each autumn when the hunting season begins and strangers once again enter the ancient woods of Harlan County, Kentucky.